This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
Former Congressman Joe Walsh here. So there's a group I recently found and have become a really big fan of. Starts With Us. They're a movement working to overcome the extreme political and cultural division in America. You can find them online at startswith.us. I love them because they're showing people it's possible to have real, meaningful, productive conversations with people you disagree with. I'm a big fan of this. This is what I try to do on my podcast because right now in America, we have two major political parties that are at each other's throats. And the most dangerous aspect of this is that it's led many of us to avoid having hard conversations with people we disagree with. We're afraid to have these hard conversations, afraid to deal with the tough stuff, so we walk away. But to save our democracy, we have to stick around. I mean, if we all walk away from the table, then who the hell is sticking around to figure things out? This is what I so love and admire about the work that Starts With Us is doing. They're sticking around. They are the movement for people like you and me who want to fight the extreme political and cultural division in this country. Because guess what? People like us, we are in the majority. Starts With Us found that 87% of Americans are tired of how politically and culturally divided we are. So yeah, I'm not just a fan, I'm part of the movement too. And if you're listening to me right now, I want you to join the movement as well. Go to startswith.us and get their free newsletter. Sign up for their free newsletter. Get involved. Start there. Startswith.us. Thanks. Joe Walsh, former Congressman Joe Walsh. This is White Flag with Joe Walsh. Thank you for listening. Listen to this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. It doesn't cost you anything. White Flag with Joe Walsh. Paul Waldman writes for the Washington Post, and he is an opinion writer for the Washington Post. And I'll bet you if you sat Paul and I down and we went over 20 to 30 policies, we'd probably disagree on most of them. But I find Paul Waldman to be one of the most interesting and thought-provoking opinion writers out there. Paul, welcome. You wrote something last week. With Nikki Haley in the headline, an article that really struck a chord with me. And I'd love to drill down on it a little bit with you. It struck a chord in me because, you know, my history, I come from kind of the MAGA base and I left the MAGA base. And your piece, sorry, Republicans, Nikki Haley can't make you young again, really resonated because so much in there, Paul, I hear from Republican base voters all the time. Start at the beginning. What compelled you to write this piece, and tell me what you were trying to get at?
Well, it started with a tweet. She tweeted out, and I can read it here.
Read the tweet.
She said, "Do you remember when you were growing up? Do you remember how simple life was, how easy it felt? It was about faith, family, and country. We can have that again, but to do that, we must vote Joe Biden out." And then she included a hashtag for the Faith and Freedom Conference.
Yeah.
And
God, what a silly tweet.
It really jumped out at me because this idea is something I've been writing about for a while. And I think it really courses through a lot of politics, especially for conservatives.
Yeah.
And I think especially a certain kind of conservative. The person I have in my head is kind of a middle-aged man who feels like things have just changed in ways that they don't like.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, this can apply to younger people. It can apply to women. But the idea is that the world is changing in ways that you feel have kind of left you behind. And this is what she's talking about, how when you were growing up, how simple life was and how easy it felt. And you know what it really reminded me of?
Huh.
Just go back a few years. And I've mentioned this from time to time, but I feel like sometimes I'm the only one who remembers it. In 2016, the Republican primary campaign was winding down,
Yeah.
and it really looked like Trump wasn't going to be dislodged. And in kind of a last-ditch effort, Marco Rubio put up an ad where he said, this campaign is about everyone who feels like they don't recognize their country anymore. And I thought, wait a minute. Marco Rubio,
Yeah.
he was supposed to be the guy who was about exactly the opposite of that. He was going to be the guy who translated the new America for his party, who was going to sell conservatism to this new generation.
Yeah.
He was young. He was bilingual. He's from a city. He grew up in Miami. He used to quote rap lyrics. He was and be kind of the next generation. And you probably remember he was on Time magazine with a cover that said the Republican savior.
Yeah.
And at that moment when his campaign was kind of floundering, he felt like he had to tap into that sentiment too, that he had to say, oh yes, it's about people who feel like they don't recognize their country. And that's the same thing that Nikki Haley is talking about here. But what's interesting about her is that she makes it so explicit when she says, when you were growing up, how simple life was and how easy it felt, and we can have that again. Well, who's the you? It could be anybody. Like if you're, in your 80s, then she's talking about what, the 40s and the 50s.
Yeah.
If you're in your 40s, maybe she's talking about the 80s and the 90s. Whenever that simpler time was, it was when you were growing up. And of course, the reason is because you were a child. That's why life was simpler when you were a child, because you were a child. It's not as though there was this very specific time in our history when everything was simpler. And since then, there's been some kind of fall. And, this also, of course, is part of what so resonated about Donald Trump's slogan, Make America Great Again. Like the most important word in Make America Great Again is again.
Again.
There was this golden era. And he never specified it either. He didn't say it was the 50s. That's the time many people locate. But he didn't say that. It was just whenever you felt like everything was right.
Is that Paul? Is that on purpose? Like, and that's a really good point. Nikki Haley doesn't specify who and when. Trump never did either. As the conversations, Paul, that I've had with Republican base voters over the years, because that's the world I come from, a lot of them kind of allude to a mythical 50s. But is it on purpose that there's no set time? It could be any time?
I think so, because a smart politician knows it could be different times for different people, and there are different things that might get you feeling that sense of alienation. Sometimes it's just the process of growing older. You turn on the radio and you don't recognize any of the music. There's research that shows that our musical tastes are formed in our teens and 20s.
Yeah.
And everything that comes afterward just sounds like it's crap, right? So it's part of just that thing about that feeling like, oh, I'm not tuned into today's music and the fashion, and kids today are doing things I don't like. We know that there's that older people always think that the kids today are lazy and they don't want to work, and they listen to this idiotic music, and there's something about just growing older that makes you feel that kind of sense of alienation from the culture in the world. And then there are some very specific things, and if you're a social conservative, certain kinds of change make you feel very alienated. Right now we're talking a lot about sexuality and gender, and that for a substantial portion of the Republican base makes them feel like the world has changed in ways that they really don't like. So whichever part of that is the thing that gets you feeling disconnected or alienated or even angry, that's what the politicians want to say, like, I'm going to fix. And that's the other thing about it too, is that the idea, as Haley says, that like we can make everything simple again, is just preposterous.
Yeah.
When you think about it for half a second. The world is always changing, and that change can be disruptive. It can be unsettling. But the idea that if you elect the right person president, we're going to be able to just turn back the clock and undo all the social changes that make you feel uncomfortable, that you don't like, and that things will be simpler again. Well, that's not the nature of the modern world or the world in general, but especially the modern world. And I think if you want to take, you can take really the 30,000 foot look at this, if you were born 1,000 years ago,
Yeah.
the world that your grandparents lived in and the world that your grandchildren lived in are exactly the same. There wasn't a lot of change going
Yeah.
on. But today, like the world that all of us knew when we were kids is very different from the one it is
Completely.
today. And our kids are growing up in a different world, and their kids are going to grow up in a world that's even more different and is probably going to be changing even more rapidly. And that's just the nature of modernity.
Yeah.
And electing the right person president is not going to put a stop to that.
So is it, Paul, so then if you stick to modern times, this notion that every generation feels this way and every generation kind of goes through this way when they get older, I get that. Is there something unique, though, and more serious, though, about this thing going on now with conservatives? Like, is this more heightened of kind of a thing here?
I think there are some things that are different. And if you look at the sort of anti-wokeness,
Yeah.
that whole effort, one of the things that distinguishes it is that if you look at people like Ron DeSantis and some of the kind of social movements coming up organically that he is glommed onto, one of the things that they promise is that you actually can do something about it. And, even
Yeah.
a small number of people, we've, my colleague Greg Sargent and I have done some reporting on what goes on in Florida. And one of the things you see when you go county by county, they now have a law that allows people to register a complaint about books that are in the school library
Exactly.
or in the classroom. And once the complaint is registered, there's a whole process that gets initiated where the book basically gets put into suspended animation. It'll be pulled while they're determining whether or not the complaint has merit. And so so what happens though, if you look at some of these places, like there are counties where there have been, 20 book challenges, and it turns out they're all from one person who is
Oh my
like the
gosh.
local Moms for Liberty person. And so just one person can get a bunch of books pulled off the shelves. And, you have a bunch of, sort of angry parents who go to a school board meeting.
Yeah.
They get things pulled. They seem to be really having a profound political effect, and it's a small number of people. And then to broaden it out just a little bit, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade,
Yeah.
and you have all of these states that have not only outlawed abortion, but are also passing bans on transgender medical care.
Right.
And so it really looks like to conservatives, they may be saying, hold on, we actually can reverse some of these social changes. And for a long time, it was part of for social conservatives, it was part of the way they looked at the world, that they're very much kind of encircled. They
Right.
They're upholding these values. The world is impinging on them everywhere they go in all kinds of different ways, especially popular culture, but even things like, there's the sign at the department store says Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas. It's everywhere. And it was very much part of this kind of heroic narrative they crafted for themselves, where, we are standing up for these eternal values, and we're encircled on all sides, and we're gonna stay true to what we believe. But part of that kind of victimhood narrative was that they were being oppressed all over the place.
Yes.
And there really wasn't much they could do about it. They're sort of martyrs. But now, with all of this activity that's happening in that goes under the heading of anti-wokeness, it really looks like some of this stuff really can be reversed. And they've kind of seized the initiative, and they, I think, are looking at, and I think this is the appeal of someone like DeSantis, is that he's saying, we actually can do
Exactly.
something about it. We don't just have to talk about how much we hate those people who we think are oppressing us. We can strike them down.
Well, and Paul, he's doing something. You're exactly right. He's literally been doing something about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're right.
And they have these book bans. They have bans on transgender medical care. He's going after Disney, and that's sort of part of his appeal. And it is different. We can talk about Ron DeSantis and whatever his weaknesses are as a candidate, but what Donald Trump really offered people was a real kind of emotional support that his candidacy said to them. We can basically put up a great big middle finger to all those people.
Bingo.
And whether or not, he made all kinds of extravagant promises. And even if you didn't think that he was actually going to make all that happen, if nothing else, you knew that him being elected was going to drive the people you hate crazy.
Yes.
So it was a very kind of emotional connection to that, and it made you feel better, even if it didn't actually change much. And what someone like DeSantis does is, he can't necessarily connect to people on that emotional level, but he's saying, I'm going to use the powers of the state to really do something about this. We're not just gonna call out transgender people because those kinds of blurring the lines of gender makes us so uncomfortable. We're going to literally run them out of this state.
Paul,
and so that's its own kind of appeal, and it's slightly different. And another interesting thing about this is that for all of this, for as much as Donald Trump has dominated Republican politics over the last 7 or 8 years, this is all happening with him really kind of as a bystander. He'll mention it when, he'll bring it up, but he's not driving things forward. And he even had that extraordinary moment at a speech a couple of weeks ago where he said something about gender, and everybody cheered. And he does this where he kind of breaks the fourth wall. he said, like, "Oh, look at this! I say we're going to cut taxes," and people are like, "Yeah, but I talk about transgender people, and everybody goes crazy." And he said something like, "A few weeks ago, you never even heard of it before."
Yeah.
So he's obviously very conscious of it. But this is not something that he's driving forward. It's happening from different places.
Paul, this is so fascinating to me, again, because I come from this world. And I've had so many of these Republican-based voters tell me the last few years, kind of a variation of, I want that America back. I kind of want that 1954 back. As you said, where you could say Merry Christmas and, it was allowed and there were two genders and men married women and women married men. I want that back. But I don't think I've had people tell me, Paul, that they don't think democracy can get it back for them. So and I think that's part of why they're drawn to a strong man like a Trump or a DeSantis to get it back for them. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's one of the really powerful undercurrents of this era and this, I think you can also lay at Trump's feet, is all of his attacks on the system of democracy.
Yeah.
It makes people feel like, well, this isn't working, even if whether you think that there's actual fraud in elections or not. But as you say, people are saying, this is not, we can't get what we want from the Democratic system. And so then where does that leave you? Well, for some small number of people, it may lead in some very, very dangerous directions. That they say, we're feeling outnumbered. There's all this change happening we don't like, and we don't think that we may not be at any particular moment the majority. And then so what do? Well, there's a powerful impulse to say, well, we're not gonna go along with this whole democracy thing anymore.
Right.
And you see a lot of that. A lot of the rhetoric around the Second Amendment is the kind of what some people call the insurrectionist view, that basically it's there so that when I feel it's appropriate, I'm going to wage war against the United States government.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people indulge in that rhetoric, even if they don't ever have any intention of actually, I don't think Ted Cruz is going to start shooting soldiers and policemen in the street, but he'll talk about it. So it is, but it is very dangerous. And I think it does expose something that the commitment to democracy as a system is really conditional. And that's something that Trump taught people was not just acceptable, but was maybe the most profound kind of patriotism. And this is what's so ironic, is that, to say that, if I fight against the system that the Constitution set up, I'm adhering to some truer version of the Constitution. And that's why you see so many people you've heard about constitutional sheriffs.
Yeah.
This is a movement among sheriffs across the country who have bought into a theory that they are actually the highest authority in the land.
Yeah.
That they can do whatever they want. Their authority exceeds that of state government and federal government, and within their county, they are the law. And they call themselves constitutional sheriffs, as though this has something to do with the Constitution. But that's one of the kind of rhetorical strains that runs through this, is that people who are rejecting democracy or rejecting the Constitution or rejecting the authority of the duly elected government will tell themselves that they are, they're the truest patriots because they're tapping into something more fundamental.
Hey, Paul, How much, and I think you're right, and the base of the Republican Party, my former party, is middle-aged and older white people. How much, how much truth is there in how they feel? And play with me for a minute. They've felt for a long time like their country is changing really quickly in a nanosecond. They said that. They voiced their frustrations and their concerns. I think the party establishment, they felt like ignored them. They've told me, liberals dominate popular culture and academia and media and all the rest, and nobody listened to them. And then you had people like me come along, Tea Party people, and we like inflamed them. And so they felt ignored and dismissed, even though there might have been like a little bit of truth. Like when Tucker Carlson had a show, he'd talk about the one Christmas pageant up in North Dakota that wouldn't let you sing real Christmas songs. And he'd make it sound like that was happening all over the country. So they have felt for a while, Paul, like nobody's listening to them. And then Trump obviously tapped into all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the Tea Party era, which led to our current era,
Yeah.
It was revealing in that way. You had this bubbling up, and the Tea Party phenomenon was complicated. It was both
Yes.
bottom up and top down.
Yes.
In some way. But you had this kind of real explosion in 2010.
Yeah.
And it turned out that a lot of the establishment Republican politicians wanted to kind of ride that tiger, but didn't know how to give them what they really wanted,
Exactly.
or just weren't capable of it. And,
Yeah.
that's why you had like whatever it was, 75 different bills or votes in the House to repeal Obamacare.
Yeah.
Right. And after a while, the people who elected them were saying like, hold on a second, like Obamacare's still there. Barack Obama's still the president. We keep having these votes, but that's not satisfying us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they felt like those leaders, of the John Boehner
Yeah.
and Paul Ryan and Eric Cantor, that they just felt like they were ineffectual. And they were right. Now, there wasn't really much else they could do. John Boehner couldn't
Nope.
snap his fingers and make Barack Obama no longer the president.
Or make
rising
Harry
frustration.
Reid no
And
longer
it
Senate majority
It really
leader.
came through in 2016 when there were, I can't even remember how many. It was like 17 or 18 candidates running for president.
Yeah.
And most of them, except for Donald Trump, were kind of traditional politicians who, by any standard, were the kind of people who would be elected in some other year. They were people who had experience in Congress or as governors, and they were very conservative, all of them. But Trump was promising something entirely different that tapped into that energy that had fed the Tea Party,
Yes.
that real frustration and anger, and that feeling like ordinary politics just was not going to cut it. But I don't know that they ever managed to figure out exactly what was going to replace it.
Yeah.
Now, right now, somebody like DeSantis is saying, I do have something different. And there's some other people within the party who are making a similar argument that the first step is to cast off the idea that Republicans are the party of small government. And instead, what they ought to do is to use the power of the state in every possible way they can to destroy liberalism.
Yes.
And it's very intoxicating to a lot of people that, because the problem with believing in small government, if you really believe it, is that every once in a while you're going to have to agree to something you don't really like. Now, as a liberal, I would say, my argument would be that very few people in the party ever believed it in the first place. It was just sort of convenient.
And Paul, that's what I was going to ask you. When I look back at a lot of my colleagues, Cruz and Don't Throw Things at Me, and Jim Jordan and Mike Lee, and all of these Freedom Caucus colleagues of mine, I'm anguished because I wonder, did they ever believe in limited government like I thought I did?
Yeah, I don't really think so. And we see it in discussions around the deficit, where it turns out that it's not really about the deficit per se or the debt per se. It's just that they can use that to to undermine the kinds of spending that they don't like anyway.
Yeah.
There are no cases where any Republican in Congress really says, I want to cut this spending, even though it's for something I like,
Yeah.
because I have a commitment to reducing the deficit. They're not, they still want to pass the biggest military budgets in recent history.
Yeah.
There's still, they opposed the increase in funding to the IRS, which everybody acknowledges is going to result in more tax revenue coming in and thereby reduce the deficit. It's just a way to undermine the spending that they don't like, which is mostly domestic spending,
Yeah.
all kinds of,
Yeah.
all the many things that the government does. And we saw that, we saw that during the Trump years. One of the things that Trump did that was very smart is that he didn't really go along with the natural implications of the kind of Paul Ryan
Yes.
outlook on government. He said, oh yeah, we're going to do the tax cut. Republicans get elected, they got to do a tax cut. We'll do that. But he was not going to cut Social Security.
No.
The efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act, they kind of went about in a half-assed way.
Yeah.
Everybody breathed a big sigh of relief when it failed.
Absolutely.
And so he kept up the spending, which was good for the economy. Because I think that he kind of on a fundamental level, more so than most Republicans, and it's in part because he is free of any kind of principle.
Yes.
He's not going to do the things that are going to be unpopular, that even Republican voters don't want to do. Like, no Republican, you can find plenty of principled Republicans, principled conservatives who will explain why we really should cut Social Security
Right.
and Medicare. But, they're not going to, Trump looks at that and he says, "You kidding me? Everybody loves Social Security and Medicare. I'm not going to touch them." And so that turned out pretty well for him. It sort of kept the economy going in a way that might not have been true had they initiated kind of dramatic spending cuts when Republicans had control of Congress.
So then, Paul, in your eyes, the Republican members like me who still consider ourselves to be limited government, free trade, free market guys, limited spending guys, in your eyes, that's always been really a minority of the party.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody has their own personal lines that they're not going to cross. But I think it's always been a very small number of people. And I in many cases, I have more fervent disagreements with some of the most principled people.
Yeah.
But they are out there.
Yeah.
And at the moment, a lot of them are some of those Freedom Caucus people who are really willing to do radical things and who would be happy to shut down the government or have a default on the debt because they believe so strongly in that. And, someone like Kevin McCarthy, he's going to try to keep them happy, but not go as far as they want to go. Like when Chip Roy is mad at Kevin McCarthy, it's that's going to happen a lot over the next year or two.
Yes.
And it's usually because someone like Chip Roy, really believes that we ought to slash and burn the whole government. I've talked to Chip Roy. He's not a phony.
No, he's not a phony. He's not a
Things that
phony.
he believes in. He's a smart guy.
Yeah.
But someone like McCarthy knows that if Chip Roy were actually running things, like that would be politically disastrous. So we've got to keep him reined in and people like him. But fortunately for McCarthy, there aren't that many of them. And so, he can kind of keep control of things and avert the worst sort of disasters as they did during the recent debt ceiling fight.
Hey, Paul, when I was running in 2010 and then after I got elected and when I served, I heard bits and pieces of this embrace of authoritarianism back then, but I ignored it. I didn't really focus on it. I wish I had more. Probably what saddened me more than anything of the last few years with what's happened to the Republican Party is this embrace of authoritarianism is fully out there. And I don't know that it's controllable anymore. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think so. And that's one of the things that Trump sort of taught the Republican base and the Republican politicians is that you can say this kind of stuff out loud. There were so many things that so many places where he took the implicit and turned it into the explicit. And that was oftentimes it was thrilling for a lot of voters.
Yeah.
And so with a lot of the stuff is, he tells you that those kind of impulses you have that you might think are supposed to be, you should keep under wraps, a little bit shameful,
Yeah.
you can just put them right out there on the table. And that will be exciting to a lot of people. And I do think that, we talked about elections and democracy. That's part of it, that he basically says that you don't need to have any kind of particular commitment to elections and democracy as a fundamental principle. If it gives you what you want and it elects the right people, then that's great. And if it doesn't, that means it was fraudulent, and you don't have to have any respect for it.
So are
But of
you
course,
not?
that's sort of one of the most foundational things
Yeah.
about democracy, is that sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. And when you lose, you say, okay, that sucks.
Yeah.
I wish it didn't happen, and I'm going to come back next time and try to win. And Trump tells people, no, it doesn't have to be that way. You just have to say that you won, and don't accept the legitimacy of your loss. And so I think that, those impulses have been there for a long time. But Trump really kind of told people to let it out, and told them that the people that they don't like are not really their fellow citizens,
Yeah.
and don't have an equal claim to representation,
Yeah.
and don't have any legitimate role to play in our system, that they are evil. They want to destroy everything you believe in and the country itself. What's one of the things he always says in all kinds of different contexts, like,
Yeah.
if they get what they want, we won't have a country anymore.
Yeah.
And so if you actually believe that the election of the other party's candidate is going to literally destroy your country, and oppress you in a way that will make it some kind of utter cataclysm, then maybe it would seem reasonable to storm the Capitol to try
Yes.
to prevent it from happening.
Yes.
So I think that it has its roots in those kind of totalistic ideas that tell you that it's not really about elections, it's not really about democracy. This is a kind of a cataclysmic war, and Armageddon is on the other side of the other side.
Bingo. Paul, that's so good. And that's what I've heard for 6 years. So, Paul Waldman, you are not surprised. I was somewhat surprised, shame on me, by how so many of my Republican voters embraced a strongman, a dictator, an authoritarian to deliver for them. The love of Orban, the indifference to or love of Putin, the love of what DeSantis, the authoritarian shit that he's doing down in Florida. You're not surprised that Republican voters, the right, so easily embraced this strongman notion.
No, and I think that one of the things about it is that it's easy for those of us who are consumed with politics and think about it all the time, but forget that most people are not like us. We're kind of weird that way.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people's ideas are, they're kind of constantly being updated by what they hear and what they see and what people they trust are saying.
Yeah.
And when, a couple of years ago, 1% of Americans knew who Viktor Orban was. And then he becomes this hero on the right,
Yeah.
and he's being talked about on, like the conservative CPAC. They go and have their conference in Hungary, and he's being interviewed by people like Tucker Carlson. He goes there, does a couple shows from there,
Yeah.
and he's being feted. And so all of a sudden, then people who, never thought about him before think, oh, well, maybe this is a reasonable model for how our system ought to run. And so, I think that's one of the things that Republicans have that Democrats don't have quite as much. I mean, Republicans look at the media system and say, well, they have captured all the big newspapers,
Right.
and liberals control the media. There are certain ways in which that's not a wholly illegitimate critique, but the difference is that the people at CNN and the New York Times don't wake up every day saying, how can we advance the cause of the Democratic Party?
Right.
But Republicans have a very tight system
Yeah, they
that
do.
is comprehensive,
Yeah.
that and really is highly coordinated. And it's not that they're getting faxes every morning telling them, what they have to say that day. Although that was once true. You may
Yeah.
remember back in the day with Newt Gingrich.
Oh, yeah.
They used to have this weekly meeting at at some Republican group where they would literally come up with the week's talking points and then fax them out to everybody.
Grover
That doesn't
Norquist.
you don't really need to do that anymore, because
Yeah.
all you have to do is turn on your TV or radio and then everybody kind of understands what you're supposed to be mad about today, what the arguments are that that you want to say, and you will, if you could go across the country, you'd hear it on every local talk radio station and from national figures on radio and on the internet and on TV, and it's a highly effective system for disseminating messages that are focused, and everybody is saying the same thing at the same time. And one of the benefits of that is that you can introduce new ideas and quickly get them out to everybody. And so you really can change how people think. Now, it doesn't always work. There are times when that system like floats an argument and it kind of falls flat because people just don't buy it. It's not perfect, but that's a real advantage Republicans have, that they're much more tightly coordinated on that. It's one of the interesting kind of ironies is that was once true in Congress too, but in Congress it's exactly the opposite. Democrats are really unified.
Yes.
And I think that it will probably still be true even with the departure of Nancy Pelosi, who that was her great talent, was keeping the caucus together. And it's the Republicans who, we used to have this cliche about Dems in disarray. That was always the headline. But now it's the Republicans who are in disarray in Congress. They have all these different factions. But meanwhile, their propaganda system is much more unified and effective. And with Democrats in Congress, they are absolutely unified. And they have a much kind of more diffuse and less effective propaganda system.
Could this have been stopped, Paul? Could the road to Trump and the road to this, what you've painted and what I believe, because I hear it all the time, kind of a radicalized Republican base that's given up on democracy. They embrace authoritarianism, as you so eloquently said, and I hear it every day. They don't want to just beat their political opponents. They want to destroy them. Could this have been stopped, or was it an inevitable road that the party was on, the Tea Party, all of us, to lead to Trump? Could we have stopped it?
A really hard question to answer. I mean, if you think back at 2016, when there was this period when Trump first ran, when people were like, "This is a joke. This guy's some just like reality show clown." Yeah. And then there was like, people felt that for a couple months, and then all of a sudden, people were like, "Wait a minute, he could actually win. We have to take this seriously." And people in the party kind of scrambled to figure out, how are we going to beat him? What can we say? Could we put up a bunch of ads criticizing him? What argument can we use? And nothing worked. And now there are people in the party who were doing the same thing. The Koch brothers organization apparently is going to spend $70 million. Like, what are they going to do? They're going to air a bunch of ads. It's hard to see it working.
No.
And it doesn't seem like anybody has the solution. And you can see it in, for instance, the reaction to his various indictments. You have a couple people like Chris Christie who are going out there and, really offering a full-throated criticism of him. But most of Trump's own opponents, you think ordinarily when you're running for office and your opponent gets indicted, that's a pretty good day for you.
It's a good day.
But no, it was a terrible day for them because they had to come out and sort of half defend him and find some way to put in a little criticism, and they couldn't figure it out. They're still afraid of his voters, who they want to become their voters.
Yes.
And so nobody in the party seems to have figured out some way to kind of break that connection. It's not that there aren't plenty of Republicans out there who don't really like Donald Trump, and
right,
and would, but there aren't enough of them. They're not over 50% of the party. And then when you get to the general election, the vast majority of them are going to say, "Well, I don't like Trump, but I'm not going to vote for a Democrat."
Right.
So now it may be a situation like 2020 when Joe Biden got a few of those Republicans and a lot of those independents, and that was enough for a relatively easy win. But the vast majority of Republican voters still stuck with their nominee.
Yeah.
And there's not much reason to think that's going to be different in 2024 if he is a nominee.
So Paul, this notion that Nikki Haley and others have put out there, this call to nostalgia, this mythical day, this works with Republican voters now. Will it work for a long, long time? How do they get out of this spell, or do they?
See, that's what I don't know. I mean, the advantageous part of it is that people keep getting old. um, that's just the nature of life. And the if you're over a certain age,
Yeah.
you still feel like the world is kind of not the way you remember it, the way you'd like it to be, even if that has to do with, the fact that like your knees ache when you go down the set of stairs. That things have changed for the worse. And
Yeah.
but on the other hand, how many times can you be told like, oh, I'm going to bring back the good old days, before you realize that, wait, the president is not going to bring back the good old days. And this was, I think that Trump had for his voters certain successes and certain failures.
Yeah.
He said that he was going to build a wall, and it's not really even about whether the wall gets finished, but the animating belief was that once we do that, we'll turn back the clock and things will be like it was when you were younger.
Yes.
And well, guess what? Those people who said build a wall, like they still hear somebody speaking Spanish when they go down to the Piggly Wiggly. Like immigrants are still here. Like that's still what's happening. The country keeps on changing, even in the ways that they don't like.
Yeah.
Their kids go to college and come back with all kinds of ideas that they don't like. There are still, like a bunch of different genders. Like Trump couldn't do that. He
Yeah.
tried. He said he was gonna turn back the clock, and it didn't happen. Even if you liked a lot of the things that he did do and you like him, like at a fundamental level, that failed. And it's always going to fail if you're promising that you're going to be able to unwind time. And so I don't know, like there's an appeal to it that will be that is perennially compelling. But I think that also, like, if you're a reasonable person, you're going to at some point say, you know what, I keep voting for people who say they're going to make things like they were when I was a kid, and it just never happens.
Paul, I left the party. 3 years ago. And I'm pretty bearish on the party. Like, I don't know that they'll recover. I mean, what's your thought? Because really, what is the Republican Party? As you said, it's middle-aged and older white people. They're dying. They die. I don't see the party replacing itself with younger voters or people of color. What's your future for this Republican Party?
Yeah, I don't know. If you look at some of the polls of younger people, especially as they're forming their political attachments, they're very strongly Democratic.
Yeah.
But also, circumstance has a great role to play. And one election, you find yourself in a recession, and then you get voted back into office, and all of a sudden you can do all kinds of things, and your party can look like it's down. And that was also one of the things that where Trump really succeeded. As we all remember, after the 2012 election, the party they commissioned this what they call autopsy, and it said, oh, we have to expand our appeal. We got to start being less harsh on immigration. And most of the people in the party thought that was the way they had to do it, even if they weren't sure exactly how, that was what they had to move toward. And Trump came along and said, no, we don't have to do that. We're going to double down on our existing base. And in 2016, it worked.
They won.
And then, you fast forward a couple of years, well, Joe Biden wins the White House, but then it's a midterm election. You know what happens in midterm elections? Well, Republicans took back the House.
Yeah.
And so there are these kind of fundamental ebbs and flows, and you never know when there's going to be a recession or some kind of other crisis, and you can keep winning some elections. And also the other part of this is that Republicans have this kind of structural advantage in the Electoral College in certain swing states where they've very successfully gerrymandered. So that there are places like Wisconsin where they don't even have to win elections to keep hold of power in the state legislature. There was an election a couple cycles ago where they got less than 50% of the votes in the state for the state Senate and still held on to like 65% of the seats. So and the Supreme Court has said that that's fine. Partisan gerrymandering is fine. And so, they have these kind of structural advantages that can make them hold on even as a minority party. And then you look at the Supreme Court where, they have this impenetrable now 6-3 majority that can give them all kinds of policy victories. And it doesn't matter whether they have majority support in the country or not. They're still getting what they want out of that court. And it's a very activist court that is going to, undo decades of jurisprudence and give them the policy successes that they want. And so in certain ways, as a Republican, you could look around and say, hey, things are going pretty well for us.
Even
We're
if,
still
Paul,
getting a lot of what we want.
even if,
And yeah, maybe we're a minority party, but that's okay because we set it up so it doesn't matter.
Paul, that's fascinating because everything you just said there makes sense, but I continue to believe the party in numbers is shrinking. Do you believe that?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. But a lot can change with the course of one presidency.
Yeah.
And the Democrats can make mistakes. And you could also have, let's say that Biden gets reelected in 2024 or 2028. You could have some incredibly charismatic Republican who comes along and wins the presidency back, and brings in a new generation of people with them, and all of a sudden it looks like things are going great again. Those at a fundamental level, I think you're right that the base is shrinking as a proportion of the population, and there are there's some Hispanics who are gravitating toward the Republican Party, but still not most of them, and so the country is getting more diverse, and that is to the advantage of the party that is itself more diverse, the Democrats.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think the average Republican probably looks at those long-term problems and says, well, that's something to worry about 20 years from now. I'm just going to try to win the next election.
Paul, do you see in the next few election cycles a successful Republican who is a free market, free trade, limited government kind of a Republican again? Or is that dead for a while?
I think it is dead for a while because, you look at sort of the Mitt Romney types.
Yeah.
And they don't really. There was always a degree to which that was a minority belief among the electorate, but you could still win some elections with it. There isn't a great desire out there for more tax cuts. That's just not what people are yearning for.
Yeah.
But that's what a lot of people within the party always believed, and I think that. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in a couple of years. Right now, what's consuming the party is the culture war.
Yes.
Now, if that turns out to be a loser, then people are going to have to react and maybe come up with something different.
How do you think, Paul, how do you think that plays in a general, the culture war? How do you think that plays for them in a general, good or bad?
I think it's going to be bad.
Yeah.
And there's all this energy on the right for things like, laws against transgender medical care and book banning, but those things are pretty unpopular.
Yeah.
The problem is that for the left is that they're just kind of behind on this, and they're starting to get organized now. And so you have a group, the Moms for Liberty is having this convention in Philadelphia. I think 5 of the Republican candidates are going there. This is a group that didn't exist a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And it's still pretty small, but all the presidential candidates are saying, wow, well, this is where the energy is now. I better get there and show them, tell them that I'm for what they're for in terms of taking control of schools. and so that stuff is very powerful in the primary, but I think there's a kind of a, dare I say it, a silent majority that's opposed to it, and doesn't really want, some like the most reactionary person in your town to decide what books go in the school library. Right. And so, I think that leaves a lot of room for Democrats to attack whoever the Republican nominee is, because they're going to be going all in on it, whoever they are. And I also think abortion is going to be a huge issue still.
Yeah.
It obviously was in 2022, and I think it's going to be a big issue because that's one of the things. There's always this dynamic in primaries where people have to run to the outer side of the party and then go back to the center in the general election. But they're all going to be making pledges for, I want a 6-week ban, I want a 5-week ban, I want a 10-minute ban, whatever it is, and that's going to be a very highly motivating issue, as we've seen for Democrats. Even in red states, there are places like Kansas where they had a referendum.
Yeah,
it's one of the most conservative states, but they came down on the pro-choice side there, and so I think that's going to be something that is going to be really powerful. And all the Republican candidates are going to have to make commitments during the primary that they're then going to have trouble explaining in the general.
I'm going to ask you, Paul, as we end, I'm going to ask you 4 disparate questions just because I'm most curious what you think on these topics. Question number one. And you and I are different. You're a good, genuine, progressive liberal. I'm a libertarian conservative. Who scares you more, Trump or DeSantis? To me, nobody scares me more than Trump. How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I think they're scary for different reasons. DeSantis is much more methodical
Yeah.
and could make progress in terms of governance that Trump just doesn't have the attention or the follow through to do. And he has some really authoritarian impulses.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, Trump is a kind of chaos monster. And you just don't know what's going to happen. And the more we hear from people who worked for him, the more we realize that we avoided even crazier stuff. And so I can't help thinking that Trump is the greater danger, but I think they're just different. And so there may not be a perfect answer to that question.
Second question. And I'll phrase it like this. Maybe this is awkward. There's a big part of me that believes the Democrats are so frickin' fortunate that the Republican Party right now is so batshit crazy, because the Democrats have issues to deal with, and they almost really don't have to deal with them right now because the Republicans are so batshit crazy. Do you buy that at all?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at what happened in 2022 and why Democrats held the Senate, in state after swing state, there could have been really close races.
Yeah.
Places like, excuse me, places like Pennsylvania and Arizona and Michigan, where in state after state, Republicans just nominated the craziest person. And it's not that the Democrats didn't have good candidates; they did, but those races were all winnable in a midterm election. Republicans could easily have taken a few more governorships and taken control of the Senate. But that's one of the things I think we don't know yet is in these places where it seemed like in every race, whoever was the Trumpiest candidate was the one who won the primary.
Right.
And that was to great benefit for Democrats. And they had candidates who, again, were perfectly good, but they might have lost in an ordinary year.
What's the Democratic Party's biggest weakness right now in your mind?
Well, I think that a lot of it is that they are a much bigger tent than Republicans are, and it's just hard to incorporate the beliefs of everyone from Joe Manchin to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and it keeps them often from having kind of a coherent philosophy, a simple way of explaining what they want to do that's easy for people to understand and appreciate. And so that's always going to be a problem. It's kind of inevitable.
Yeah.
There are reasons why things might work better if we had 5 or 6 parties, but we only have 2.
Yeah.
So yeah. And obviously, Joe Biden, I think that his age is a legitimate concern. And that's, something that right now, I mean, that's its own kind of weakness. Like your average Democrat thinks that it's a problem and there's no way out of it. You're not going to nominate somebody else.
Yeah.
He wants to run again. He's going to run again. And I know there are a lot of Democrats who are really scared that in, October of 2024, he'll have some kind of health crisis or something.
Bingo.
But the attitude is like, there's nothing we can do, and we just have to keep our fingers crossed.
Second to last question. I am a rare conservative who would do away with the Electoral College tomorrow if I could. I'm assuming you probably agree with that. My question is, maybe you don't. My question is, and I know how impossible almost it is to get rid of it, could we ever, and will we ever reach a time, Paul, where the country just falls apart because the Democrats keep winning the popular vote and elections aren't tenable because of the Electoral College?
Yeah, I think we could. I mean, I do think, somehow every other democracy on earth manages to have elections where you count the votes and the person with the most votes wins. It's not some kind of crazy idea.
Yeah.
And I think that the more we get geographically polarized, the angrier Democrats will get. And right now, Democrats' anger about it is, it's kind of on a moderate level. it could be a lot worse.
Yeah.
And so if you get another election or two, we've had 2 out of the last 5, whatever it was, where the Republican took office despite having lost the popular vote. If we get another one or another 2 of those,
Yeah.
I think the anger is going to start to build and build, and then you really could get some kind of a crisis. But the thing is, the way that that the process for amending the Constitution works is that it gives veto power to the very people who, in this case, you're trying to take power away from.
Exactly.
Now, you have the national popular vote thing,
Yeah.
which is a very clever workaround,
Uh-huh.
but it needs a few more states in order to be put into effect. And that, I think, if that actually happened, that would lead to its own revolt on the right. I don't know. It's hard to think about how this all gets resolved in some kind of a permanent settlement, given the direction that we're moving in terms of the geographic polarization, as I said, that doesn't just allow the anger to get worse and worse and worse over it.
So, Paul Waldman, that leads me to my final question, which is this, my liberal friend. Are you bearish or bullish on this American experiment? I'm a dark Irishman. I'm bearish. I worry that this country will just not be able to keep it together. What's your overall thought?
Yeah, I wish I had one coherent thing that I could tell you. It depends on the day. There are days when I look around and say, things are going to be okay. And then there are days when I think, we're all headed down the hill toward disaster.
Yeah.
So I wish I had a better answer than that. But these days, my worry days slightly outnumber my optimistic days.
He's one of my favorite reads. Everybody should follow him on Twitter at Paul Waldman1, the number 1, at Paul Waldman1. Read him every week in the Washington Post. You'll learn something. Paul, thanks so much.
Thank you, Joe. It was a great pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.
I found it. Look, I love ice cream, but I'm not 18 years old anymore, so I can't eat a lot of it. But I found it. I found a healthy ice cream alternative that actually tastes great. Sweet pea non-dairy ice cream. Get this. It's made with chickpeas. I know. It tastes great. Tastes and feels like real ice cream. Look, I screwed around with soy-based and oat-based products. They all tasted like shit. Sweet pea made from chickpeas is the first healthy alternative I've found that I absolutely love. I'm in DC. I get sweet pea at Giant Foods. If you're in DC, Philly, Pennsylvania, go to Giant Food stores. If you're in New York City, go to Balducci or Key Foods. In San Francisco, go to Nugget. You will absolutely love this. It tastes great. Made with chickpeas. That's so cool. It tastes great.